Uh, no. I think we're going to have to knock down a wall or two here. It's a great turnout, and I want to thank you all for being here. My pleasure. These are the things I enjoy almost more than anything else. It's a lot more fun than being in Washington, I'll tell you that. What I want to do today is, let me start off by thanking the UAW. I think many people in America, and it's something we're trying to do, is to educate people about the role that trade unions play and have played in the history of this country. And UAW historically has been one of the great unions in America. And as a result of all of your efforts in standing up for justice, standing up for the rights of working people, you have improved lives, not only for your own members, hundreds of thousands of those, but for millions of other people. Because as you drove up wages, as you demanded that workers be treated with respect and dignity, even non-union employers had to respond. So thank you, UAW, for what you did. As we were driving, and we had a great rally last night in Madison, and as we were driving from Madison to Oshkosh, I was thinking of photographs, which I think many of you have seen, when Walter Reuther and the other UAW organizers were beaten by Ford thugs. You remember those pictures? And, their job was what they were trying to do was organize Ford, tremendous opposition, and they were beaten up and intimidated. But workers fought back with sit-down strikes and everything else and managed to form the great unions that we have today. But what I want to tell you is that corporate tactics have changed. They don't hire thugs to beat up organizers anymore. They got a different tactic. They hire consultants. They hire anti-union law firms. They spend huge amounts of money. And here is the good news. The good news is that working people all over this country are standing up, fighting back, and are forming unions in a way we have not seen for many decades. And not surprisingly, corporate response, whether it's at Starbucks or Amazon or other places, and we're talking about blue-collar workers, talking about white-collar workers, we're talking about service employee workers forming unions. They are all, the employers are fighting back by doing everything they can to fire organizers, to literally shut down shops that have voted for unions, refusing to negotiate a first contract. That is why together, the very top of my list of things that we have got to do with a Democratic majority is we all understand we do not rebuild the American middle class unless we rebuild the trade union movement. And we will not accept the blatantly illegal activities of these large billionaire-owned corporations who are intimidating workers and preventing them from exercising their constitutional rights. And that's why we're going to pass legislation. And at the end of the day, we have to understand that there is a reason why we have fewer people in unions today than many years ago. And that's why we need strong labor law reform, which ultimately says that if 50 workers in a unit plus one sign a damn card that they want to be a member of a union, they have a union. And if employers refuse to recognize that union and negotiate a contract in a reasonable period of time, we're going to throw the book at those employers. Now, I'm here today to kind of chat with you about short-term activities that we need and longer-term efforts that we need. Short-term, the issue is obvious. Right now, we have a 50-50 United States Senate. And this midterm election, in my view, is the most consequential midterm election in the modern history of this country. And what it will determine is which party controls the Senate, which party controls the House. If we can win here in Wisconsin, we will not only, I think, control the United States Senate again, we will have the votes that we need to overcome two corporate Democrats and begin to really address the crises facing the working class of this country. So right now, to be very honest with you, I'm going to tell you stuff, the others may not tell you. But I think you deserve to hear the truth. You got two corporate sellouts in the Democratic Senate right now. We need two other Senates, and when we do that, two other senators, and Mandela will be one of those. He'll be a great senator. And when we have Mandela and hopefully Fetterman in Pennsylvania, we can begin to finally sit down and address the needs of working families. Now, this campaign, this election is about a lot of stuff. It's about whether women will be able to continue to control their own bodies. It is about whether we are going to be able to work with other countries to deal with the existential threat of climate so that our kids and grandchildren can live in a country and in a world which is healthy and is habitable. And despite right-wing propaganda, let me tell you this. If we transform our energy system away from fossil fuel, we can create millions of good-paying jobs, and that is exactly what we've got to do. And this election, and honest to God, I never thought that as a United States Senator, I would ever have to say this. I've been in politics for a while, and you debate issues, and that's fine. They got their point of view. I've got mine. But this campaign is also about whether we preserve the foundations of American democracy. As we were driving here just an hour ago, I learned, according to CNN, that your Senator Ron Johnson is not quite so sure that he'll accept election results if he loses. Well, we got news for Senator Johnson and Donald Trump and all these other guys. Democracy, in a democracy, sometimes you win and sometimes you lose. And it's not just a great election and a fair election. When you win, you'll lose elections. So be a man. Have the guts to stand up and say, I lost. Don't be a whiner and a wimp. People lose. In 1988, I was mentioning this last night in Madison. 1988, Vermont has all of one member of Congress. And I ran for Congress. I knocked my ass off. My God, I worked 20 hours a day. Never worked so hard in my life. And we were taking on, I'm an independent, taking on a Democrat and a Republican. And we thought we had a shot to win it. And on election night at 1 o'clock in the morning, turned out that we lost by 3 points. And I was heartbroken. I was really sad. But I didn't go crying that it was a fraudulent election. I called up and conceded to my opponent. 2 years later, I came back and I won by a landslide. And that's what democracy is about. Democracy is about, you got a point of view, I got a point of view, take it to the people. And if you lose, learn your lesson. Come back the next time. But don't undermine American democracy and think that the only way you lose is if there's fraud. That is disgraceful. And I will say this from the bottom of my heart. All of you know this. Wisconsin and Vermont, throughout this country, millions of people have put on their uniforms. They fought and died for something special, and that is democracy. We are the greatest democracy in the history of the world, and that means the people rule, not an autocracy, not a bureaucracy, not a king, not a queen, but the people. And we will not allow Trump or anybody else to undermine that democracy. But I want to talk about not just the contrast, the obvious contrast between Mandela and Johnson. I mean, it is unbelievable to me that you're in a tight race. Mandela should be winning this thing by 20 points. You got one candidate, Mandela, who believes that if somebody works 40 hours a week, he or she should not be living in poverty. That's what the American people believe. You got another guy, your current senator, I know Ron Johnson, he's on the budget committee, which I chair, who literally believes that we should end the concept of the minimum wage. Now here you got a $7.25 minimum wage here, which is a disgrace unto itself. But what he believes, let the market rule, and if the economic downturn comes, there's a lot of unemployment, and an employer can hire you for $5 an hour, let the market rule. That is disgraceful. People in this country want to see working people earn a livable wage, at least $15 an hour. Nelson. But the differences is even greater. Right now, and I'm going to talk about this in a moment, we got more income and wealth inequality today. I don't know how many people know that. Media doesn't talk about it much. We got more income and wealth inequality anytime in American history. For all of you in this room who are billionaires, let me congratulate you. You have never done better. Your class has never done better. And yet, despite that, Johnson and Mitch McConnell and virtually the entire Republican leadership, they want to end the estate tax, which applies only, they will lie about this and say it applies to family farmers. It does not. It applies to the top 0.1%. If they are successful in repealing the estate tax, it will result in an increase in the national debt of $1.75 trillion. That's a lot of money. And it will do things like give Elon Musk's family, and I have nothing against his kids or his wife or whatever, an $80 billion tax break. Well, I may be crazy, but I think in these days, this time, maybe Musk's family does not deserve an $80 billion tax break. But apparently that is what Ron Johnson believes. Now, in order to pay for this $1.75 trillion tax break for the top 1/10 of 1%, 99.9% of the people would not benefit a nickel, they have another brilliant idea. And that is at a time when seniors are struggling to heat their homes, to buy their medicine, they want to cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. So I think the choice in this election could not be clearer. At a time when working families are struggling, we need a man who comes from a union background, who understands what the working class is dealing with today. We've got to elect Mandela Barnes as our next senator. So brothers and sisters, today I am asking you to work as hard as you can in the next 4 days. It's going to be a close election. and drag out your friends and your coworkers and your aunts and your uncles and everybody else. You bring out 3 other people, you have tripled your political input. Let's do it. But I want to now go a little bit further beyond the next 4 days. And I want to tell you what very few members of the Congress will tell you. And that is, my concern is not only about all of the things I've already mentioned, the state of our democracy. It is about the movement of this country into an oligarchic form of society. You all know what I mean by that? Now, oligarchy is not a new concept globally. Many Latin American countries, for example, historically have had a family or two controlling the economics, the politics, the media of those countries, run by just a small number of people. Now, the media doesn't talk about it for obvious reasons. But right now, we are moving toward an oligarchic form of society. Let me tell you what I mean. For a start, in terms of our economy, we're seeing more and more concentration of ownership. What do I mean by that? You got 3 Wall Street firms. Listen to this. That is BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. 3 firms controlled by a small number of people who control assets of over $20 trillion, which is equivalent to the GDP of the United States of America. And with those assets, they are major stockholders in hundreds and hundreds of corporations. During the last couple of years, I've been involved in a number of strikes, working with workers who are on strike, including John Deere and others, UAW. And what I want to tell you, what amazed me, you could understand that if a company was experiencing tough time, they were losing money, they might go to their workers and say, hey, look, these are tough times, you got to do this, you got to take this sacrifice. In virtually every instance, we've been involved in maybe a dozen strikes all across this country. In every single instance, corporations are making huge amounts of money, huge amounts of profits. And then they come back and they're squeezing their workers for cuts in health care or other benefits. And what we find is you're dealing with the company, you're not dealing with the company, they're owned by somebody, and that somebody is owned by somebody else. And it turns out that you're living in an economy where a small number of people have enormous economic power. They will determine whether jobs stay in Vermont or Wisconsin or go to China or Mexico. They will determine whether workers have decent health care, decent schedules, decent benefits, or whether they're treated like garbage. That's the decision that these handful of people make. That's the economy. And what oligarchy is big money control over the political process. So it's not just the economy. These guys with all of their wealth, and let me talk about wealth for a moment. Today in America, and this is really quite unbelievable. Media doesn't talk about it. My colleagues in the Congress don't talk about it because many of them are funded by these corporate interests. In America today, you not only have more income and wealth inequality than any time in the history of this country, you got 3 people, 1, 2, 3, who own more wealth than the bottom half of American society, 165 million. 3 people, 165 million. That is not what this country is supposed to be about. You got the top 1% owning more wealth than the bottom 92%. And I want to tell you something else, which talks about the kind of greed and class warfare that is going on. And I use that word advisedly. You all know what I mean by class warfare? All right, what class warfare is about is, all of you know, we have gone and are still going through this terrible, terrible pandemic, which has taken over 1 million lives in this country. And when you look at what's happened during the pandemic, you learn a lot about what's going on in America. Tens of thousands of American workers, people who work in hospitals. We have lost over 5,000 nurses during this pandemic, people who put their lives on the line to treat us, those of us who had COVID. We have lost people who work in meat processing plants, public transportation, cops, firemen, people who are out in the public. We have lost tens of thousands of workers who went to work because they didn't have a choice. By the way, they had to feed their families, okay? At the same time, During this pandemic, the billionaire class saw a $2 trillion increase in their wealth. Workers died and billionaires became much richer. We cannot allow that dynamic to continue. And these billionaires, you know, we have, all of you know, and many of you have friends, family dealing with it. We have a major addiction problem in this country, right? We got drug addiction, lost 100,000 people last year to opiates. We have alcohol addiction, alcoholism, serious problem. People dealing with tobacco, serious problem, etc. But I'll tell you about another addiction that exists in this country, which may be the most serious of all. And I can't put my head around it. You got people who have billions and billions of dollars in wealth, and you might think that that would be just enough to get by, right? They can take care of their families for 1,000 years. And yet, despite all of their wealth, all of their private islands that they own, all of their private jets that they own, all of their goddamn mansions they own all over the world, enough is not enough. They want more and more and more. And they're squeezing workers in order to become even richer. They also are suffering from an addiction, which is very serious. And that is the addiction of greed. And we have got to cure them of that addiction. So you got a handful of people with enormous economic power, and the same group of people have enormous political power. And I talked before about the danger of Trump and Johnson and all these guys for our democracy, but they're not the only problem. I don't have to tell you all, you are living right now in the midst of a corrupt political system where billionaires are trying right now as we speak, turn on the TV, billionaires all over this country are spending hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars to buy and sell politicians. All right. So what you got? I was just in California the other day supporting a candidate for mayor, a very fine woman. Her opponent is a multi-billionaire who is spending $100 million to be mayor of LA. $100 million. I'm going tomorrow to Pittsburgh to stand with a very brave young woman who's a workers' rights advocate, going to fight for people of color. She, in the last week, there'll be over $1 million in TV ads coming from some corporate super PAC trying to defeat her. And we're seeing that all over this country. So yeah, we live in a democracy, but these guys increasingly own that political process. And that is why we need to overturn this disastrous Supreme Court decision on Citizens United. We need public funding of elections. You know, democracy is supposed to be, maybe I'm old-fashioned, but it's supposed to be a clash of ideas. You got your ideas, I got my ideas. Take it to the people. You like me, vote for me. You like my opponent, vote for them, whatever the hell. That's it. And I would like to see in America more and more young people, working class people, running for office. But you can't do that if you're going to have to spend half of your time hustling money from wealthy people. That's not democracy. So we have got to reform our political system. Now, there is a lot of anger in this country, right? We all know that. People are angry. And you know what? People have a right to be angry. But if you're angry, you got to know to whom, where you're focusing your anger. You can't just lash out, I'm angry. You know, Trump is tapping a lot of that anger. All right, but why are people angry? Let's talk about it. Well, for a start, and the media doesn't talk about this terribly much, real inflation adjusted for wages today are lower than they were almost 50 years ago. All right? Somebody should check it out. See what the guys and women UAW made here 49, 50 years ago, and in real wages, you may be worse off than they were then. I don't know if that's the case here. Maybe for union workers it's not the case. But that is the case nationally. Since 1975, there has been a $50 trillion transfer of wealth from the bottom 90% to the top 1%. So what you have seen, is people today are working incredibly hard. 60% of Americans in the wealthiest country in the history of the world are living paycheck to paycheck. Everybody here know what paycheck to paycheck is about? That's my family. I grew up. Dad worked really hard. But at the end of the week, he got his check and that paid for the bills. That's it. So people are working. In some cases, they're falling even further behind. 60% of our people. While the billionaire class are making out like bandits, because, in fact, many of them are bandits. Now, people are angry because they're working hard and in many cases going nowhere in a hurry. They're working hard because they can't afford health care, and I know almost every union contract comes down to whether or not they're going to cut health care, right? All right. Cost of health care is off the charts. So people are angry. They're saying, hey, I'm working hard. I can't even take my kid to a doctor. I got a huge co-payment, a deductible, whatever it may be. People are angry. They can't afford, young parents can't afford childcare. You know what the average cost of childcare in America is today? $15,000 a year. So if you're making $60,000, $70,000, how can you afford childcare? And yet you need childcare if you got to go to work. And by the way, I want you to understand again in terms of the state of the economy. When I was a kid a few years ago, all right, before all of the new technology and all of the increase in productivity, young people may not believe me, but it's true. In those days, in most cases, all it took was one breadwinner in the family to work 40 hours a week and earn enough to pay the bills. All right? Today, because of the cost of healthcare, the cost of education, the cost of housing, there are very few working class families where mom and dad are not both working. All right? So what we have now is a situation, and again, let me also make it a third point about what big money does. Big money owns the media. Now, I don't believe in fake news. That's Trump's thing. Most of the reporters I know, and I deal with reporters every day, they report what you say accurately. They try hard. They work hard. Many of them don't make a lot of money themselves. But because you have 6 large media conglomerates in America owning 90% of what you see here in Reed, they kind of determine the issues that are important, that are not important. So it's not that it's fake news. It's what they choose to cover and what they choose not to cover. So issues of income and wealth inequality, the decline of the middle class, by and large, the greed of the corporate class does not get the kind of attention that it deserves. So where are we now, and what do we have to do as America, as a country? What Trump and his friends are doing is sensing correctly that people are angry. And what they are doing is tapping into that anger in a way that divides us up. They're trying to divide us up by the color of our skin, by where we were born, by our sexual orientation, by our religion. That's what they are trying to do. We're blaming each other rather than coming together and fighting for an agenda that works for all of us. And what I hope that we can be thinking about is what we want this country to be in the future. So let me tell you what we all know that the country is divided on a lot of issues, and that is true. But by and large, on economic issues, believe it or not, the country is fairly united. Ron Johnson notwithstanding, most Americans want to raise the minimum wage to a living wage. At least $15 an hour, and today more than that. All right. Ron Johnson notwithstanding, most Americans want to make it easier for workers to join unions. Ron Johnson notwithstanding, the American people understand that health care is a human right, not a privilege. So these are some of the basics that our people are united on. Now I want to say something else, maybe close on this note. Republicans are going around the country saying that, Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders and others, we are the cause of inflation. Well, they kind of forgot to tell you that inflation is higher in the United Kingdom, higher in Ireland, higher in Germany, higher throughout Europe, higher in many countries around the world. So sadly, inflation, which is very high in America, 8.2%, is a global problem. What is it caused by? Well, it's caused by the pandemic and the breakdown in international supply chains. It is caused, I'll get there. Give me a moment. It is caused by the war in Ukraine, and as this young man interrupted me, it is absolutely caused by corporate greed. In fact, a study came out recently that tells us that over 50% of the cause of inflation in the United States is in fact corporate greed. And it's not hard to understand. All right, you go out, you fill up your gas tank, what is it, $4 around here for a gallon of gas? That's about what it is in Vermont right now. In the West Coast, it's higher. Texas, it's lower. But whatever it is, it's gone up. Look at the outrageous level of profits of Exxon Mobil, of Conoco, Phillips. The oil companies are enjoying record-breaking profits. You go to the grocery store and you think about elderly people living on a fixed income, looking at how much a pound of hamburger costs. Food industry is making record-breaking profits. We pay right now the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs, sometimes 10 times more for the same bloody drug as they do in Canada, other countries. Look at the profit margin of the drug companies, record-breaking profits. These guys, and I want you to think about this from a moral sense, to the degree that any of these guys have any sense of morality. But if you're sitting up there and you're saying, hey, look, we're living in a moment, this pandemic has been terrible for the American people, for the world. You got a horrible war in Ukraine. All of this stuff is going on. What can we do as CEOs of large corporations to make life a little bit easier for working people? Trust me, that is not what they're thinking. What they are thinking is, hey, who's going to notice? There's all this crap going on in the world. People are confused. We can blame everybody in the world. Now is the time to jack up our profits, jack up the prices that people have to pay. Who's going to notice? And we'll give stock buybacks to our wealthy shareholders. That's where they come from. That is really quite disgusting, if you ask me. Now, when Trump and Johnson and others blame me and Biden for inflation, and they're saying it's government spending. I want to spend a moment on this, because really what they are talking about in quote-unquote government spending, you know what they're talking about? They're talking about the American Rescue Plan, and I want to spend a moment on that. I am the chairman of the U.S. Senate Budget Committee, and as chairman of that committee, I helped write the American Rescue Plan. And I am here today to tell you that I apologize for nothing in that plan. Now, I want to take you back. As Americans, we have, all of us have these short memories. We forget what happened the day before yesterday. You get my age, you forget what happened yesterday, actually. But let's think back. Think back to early 2021. I want you to think back. Country was suffering the worst public health crisis that we have experienced in 100 years. You all remember it. And many of you may have lost friends who died or seen people your loved ones become very, very ill. During that time, 3,000 Americans were dying every single day. During that time, doctors and nurses were dying because they didn't even have the personal protective equipment, the masks, the gowns, the gloves that they needed. During that time, hospitals were flooded with patients, and many of them were on the verge of collapse. That was what was going on from a public health point of view. from an economic point of view, at that point, because people were afraid of getting sick, people were not going to work, businesses were shutting down all over America, small businesses were going bankrupt, more people were losing their jobs or are underemployed or are given up looking for work than at any time since the Great Depression. Millions of people, you all remember that, right? Lost their jobs. And that's the crisis that we were looking at in early 2021. And what the president said, what I said, what others said, is we cannot turn our backs on the American people who are frightened about this pandemic, who are suffering economically. We are going to stand with the American people. And that's what we did. This is what we did. Some people may have forgotten. We provided $1,400 for every man, woman, or child in the midst of a major economic crisis. No apologies from me. We expanded and extended unemployment benefits for the millions of people who lost their jobs. No apologies. At a time when we had the highest rate of childhood poverty of almost any major country on earth, in the middle of that pandemic, we said we're going to help working parents $300 a month child tax credit. We put billions of dollars into keeping hospitals afloat at a time when they needed desperately that money. I was at the UW Eau Claire yesterday, and the guy there was telling me that as a result of the American Rescue Plan, that school, one small school, got $10 million for 5,000 kids who were unable to go to school and yet had to pay their room and board. We helped working class kids who were in serious economic trouble. And that's what we did. We saved millions of jobs, and in fact, that act, in the midst of one of the worst crises in the modern history of this country, God knows how many lives were saved, how much dignity was restored. That's what we did. So to Ron Johnson and to Donald Trump and to all these guys, I don't apologize for that act. That's what a government should do in a civilized, democratic society. And I should tell you that to pass that piece of legislation, we got zero, not one Republican vote. It was passed 50 to 49. All right? So I want all the folks in Wisconsin who remember back, who had lost their jobs, who were struggling, who got some help from the federal government, think about who helped you. It was not Ron Johnson and the Republican Party. So brothers and sisters, we are where we are today. We're 4 days away from an enormously important election which will determine the future of this country. But what I'm asking you is not only to work as hard as you can in the next 4 days, I'm asking much more for you. The future of this country is at stake, no matter what happens on election day. We're taking on a handful of billionaires who have unbelievable economic, political, and media power. And what Republicans want to do is to divide us up, to fight amongst each other, black workers, white workers, Latino workers. We can't allow them to do that. We got to, this is what a union is about. You know that. What a union is about by definition, that's what the word means. One person cannot negotiate with his or her boss. You have no power. But when you stand together, you do have power. And that's what we have got to do. That's what we've got to do. And I think in the middle of that is the growth of the trade union movement, because we need, if ever before in American history, now is the time. We need a real counterbalance to the corporate greed that is hurting our country so much. So what I'm asking you all is, let us stand together. Let us fight for the nation that we know we can be. A nation built on economic justice, racial justice, social justice, environmental justice. We can be that nation if we come together and have the courage to take on the greed of people who right now could care less about working families. So let's take them on. Let's win this election. Let's go forward. Thank you all very much.